Hello. So in this video, I'm going to do a rhetorical analysis of one sentence of Mary Seacole's autobiography, The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands, because I think this is such a fascinating single line in terms of what it does to build her ethos, her credibility, her trustworthiness, her reliability for her original audience. So, a little bit of background and context, because it's very important here. So, Mary Seacole was born around about 1805. She was born in Kingston, Jamaica. She was on her father's side of Scottish descent and on her mother's side of Creole descent. So her mother was probably mixed race, but Mary Seacole is today regarded as part of the African diaspora. She's regarded as a black woman. Because race is a social construct, definitions of race slightly change over time. It's not clear from The Wonderful Adventures that Seacole considered herself to be black in the way that we would think of it today. But today, most people would agree that with contemporary constructs of race and racial categorization, that is an accurate description for her ethnic identity. She was not wealthy, which, of course, in Victorian society was a huge disadvantage. She was black, or at least partially black, which, of course, in Victorian society, I mean, it's worth keeping in mind, while Seacole and her family were not slaves, slavery in British colonies was legal up through the Anti-Slavery Bill of 1833, which took effect in 1834, and didn't really practically free people until 1838. And so throughout much of Seacole's life, slavery was a reality for most black people in Jamaica. Seacole was also a doctoress. She wasn't a nurse in that she was not sort of properly medically trained. She was something probably closer to a herbal medicine specialist, a holistic doctor, alternative medicine, this kind of thing. And she apparently was quite good at it, according to her own autobiography, but also the testimonies of others writing about her as a medical practitioner. So all of that stuff matters because it helps to position Seacole within Victorian society. She is very much an outsider. She is very much an independent woman. She is a widow. And so she's got all of these social elements working against her. And one of the things that she continually does throughout The Wonderful Adventures is tries to build her credibility. But I'm really fascinated by this one line at the end of the first paragraph. Because she sort of introduces this idea that she has traveled throughout the world, which really she had. She'd gone from Jamaica to Panama to different places in sort of Central America, back to Jamaica. She had been to Britain. She'd gone down and around through the Mediterranean to go and serve in the Crimean War. So she was well traveled, better traveled than the vast majority of people during the Victorian era. And so she has this line here. Last two sentences, technically, of this opening paragraph. Some people indeed have called me quite a female Ulysses. I believe that they intend it as a compliment, but from my experience of the Greeks, I do not consider it a very flattering one. there's so much going on in these two sentences that I think really, really works super, super well for a Victorian audience, and probably for us today does not work quite as well to build Seacole's ethos, partially because her very critical view of contemporary Greeks, in this case, the Greeks of the 1850s, is really quite problematic. Like she very much stereotypes them. She very much has this sort of, oh, they're dirty, they're thieves, she brings up all of these negative stereotypes, which for a modern day reader, many of us will find that approach quite distasteful. But to a Victorian reader especially, this would be a really effective technique because for a number of reasons. So one is the reference to Ulysses. So who is Ulysses? Ulysses is the Roman name or the Latin name for Odysseus, the lead figure of Homer's The Odyssey, one of the great heroes of classical antiquity. So what is this doing? On the one hand, this is building Seacole's ethos by showing, oh, I know this classical reference. I know Homer. I know what people mean when they talk about Ulysses, when they talk about this great classical hero that the educated classes would have known about. Now, there are sort of arguments that, in fact, classical knowledge was much wider spread than we tend to think of it, but the people who would be reading the Odyssey in the original Greek would very much be exclusively the wealthy, the socially privileged, the upper classes. And so while classical texts were pretty widely available in translation, were actually quite popular, at least according to some arguments, that reference, that classical reference, nonetheless, builds her credibility by aligning her with a body of knowledge that was associated with wealth, privilege, education, knowledge, sophistication, etc., etc. So there's that element of it. But then we get this next sentence, which I think is even more subtle in its application. I believe that they intend it as a compliment. Okay, fine. That's not the part that interests me. It's the second clause. But from my experience of the Greeks, I do not consider it a very flattering one. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because it positions Seacole as in the same tradition, the same sphere as people who went on the Grand Tour. Right? So the Grand Tour really sort of starts in the 1700s as a thing that wealthy upper crust Europeans do, particularly the British, the English especially, but the Welsh, Scottish, and Northern Irish, and Anglo-Irish to a lesser extent. The French and the Germans, these are really the people who embrace the Grand Tour. And basically what the Grand Tour was at some point in a young man's education, mostly young men, but young women occasionally did it as well, you would basically take a kind of gap year, right? So you would hit a decent stopping point in your studies, and you would go abroad, particularly to Italy, to places like Florence, Milan, Rome, these sort of great classical centers of Renaissance or Roman history, learning, knowledge, arts, etc. And you would go and see the great masterpieces of the Renaissance. You would go and see the Colosseum. You would go and see these sort of remnants of Roman architecture, etc., etc. And then you would go to Greece. You would go to Athens in particular and see the Parthenon. You would go and see the whatever was available there. And basically the idea was that, like a study abroad today, essentially, right? Where you go, like I'm currently leading a study abroad trip to London, right? We are improving our understanding of these British literary texts by situating them in their contexts. It was the same basic thing for the Grand European Tour. You went to these places of high repute, classical associations, Renaissance associations, etc., and different tours went to different places. People saw different things, but this was essentially what you would do. Now, so Seacole is establishing, I have traveled to Greece. I have been to this place. It was a key stop on the Grand European Tour. And so again, my experiences align with those of the wealthy, the privileged, the powerful. But there's more. One of the very common things that these Europeans, particularly people, Hellenophiles was the term. These people who really, really loved ancient Greece, the philosophy, the art, the drama, the history. People like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Aristophanes, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Herodotus, etc., etc. The people who were just fascinated by this from Northern Europe. They would come to Greece, and one very common experience they would have would be this massive disappointment in modern Greeks, because what these people came, what the Hellenophiles came expecting, and partially this is just sort of sheer stupidity, but what they came expecting was that the Greeks would be wearing not togas, but the robes of ancient Greece, that they would be sitting around discussing Aristotelian philosophy, that they would be watching 1,000-year-old, 1,500 to 1,800, whatever it is, 2,000-year-old plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, etc., etc., that they would just have stagnated, that they would remain the ancient Greeks of classical antiquity. And of course, what that ignores is the very obvious changes created by almost 2,000 years of Greek Orthodox Christianity being the dominant religion, and several hundred years of Ottoman Turk control of Greece. Greece becomes independent of the Ottoman Empire in in the 1820s, partially with support from Northern European Hellenophiles who wanted ancient Greece to be reborn. And actually, when the Greek state is set up, this is a whole problematic thing. But when the Greek state is set up, they do actually try to erase much of the non-ancient Athenian elements of Greek culture, which of course does not work, because Greek culture, like all cultures that still where there are actual human beings, is a living culture. But there was this widespread desire among Northern European Hellenophiles for ancient Greek, for the modern state of Greece and the modern Greek people to be this sort of time capsule of 5th century BCE Athens, which of course it never was going to. And so there was widespread discontent and disgust with modern Greeks, whom Northern European Hellenophiles often felt were not the true inheritors of the ancient Greek tradition, but that these Germans, French, English, or British, who idolized the ancient Greeks, were the true inheritors of that tradition. And so when Mary Seacole says, "From my experience of the Greeks, I do not consider it a very flattering comparison," she's reflecting that widespread aristocratic prejudice against modern Greeks, right? So this is an interesting thing. She is, in these two sentences, identifying herself in three major ways with the upper crust, with those with social power, social authority, etc., etc. She is referring to classical literature, which of course, strengthens her sort of claim to be someone of knowledge and respectability and taste. She identifies her own travels as aligning with that of the Grand Tour, which of course was very much an upper class pastime meant to refine young people. And she reflects a similar negative judgment on contemporary Greeks as that which many members of the Northern European upper classes experienced. So again, she is sort of using these references very quickly and very, very subtly, but very effectively for a Victorian audience to build her credibility by saying, I am just like the upper classes who hold these views of things. And again, because today we no longer have the Grand Tour, we no longer have classical education in the same way that they did in the Victorian period, and we no longer have quite that same troubled view of modern Greeks, it doesn't work quite the same way for contemporary readers that it would for Victorians. But it's a very interesting thing nonetheless.